Amani Rivers sat at her small, scarred wooden table, staring at the digital balance on her phone, $14.12. She refreshed the app, praying for a glitch, a mistake, a miracle, but the number remained cold and unmoving. In her other hand, she clutched a final notice utility bill, the red ink glowing like a warning flare under the dim kitchen light. A miracle had never visited this part of the city. For Amani, life was a series of subtractions, selling her textbooks for grocery money, skipping meals so her younger brother, Malik, wouldn't have to study on an empty stomach, and working 3 part-time jobs until her body felt like lead. The eviction notice on the door was the final blow. She had exactly 4 days to find the money, or they would be on the street. Outside, the sky had opened up in a torrential downpour. Rain lashed against the cracked window pane like gravel. The city was drowning, and Amani felt like she was going down with it. She opened the cupboard, a single box of crackers and a jar of peanut butter. Her stomach twisted with a hunger she had learned to ignore. The lights flickered, a rhythmic hum of a power grid on the verge of collapse. Everything was failing. 2 months ago, she was a top-tier student with a future. But when her mother passed, the system forgot her. No connections, no safety net. She was just a girl in a worn earth-tone sweater trying to hold back the tide. Guilt was her constant shadow, guilt that she couldn't give Malik the life he deserved. The apartment was freezing. She pulled her sleeves over her hands, huddled in the only warmth she had left, her empathy. Then came the sound. Not a knock, but a heavy, sliding thud against the door. Amani jolted, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was nearly midnight. No one came to this floor at this hour unless they were looking for trouble. She stood up slowly, her natural curls frizzy from the damp air, her eyes wide with a fear she'd known her whole life. Through the peephole, she didn't see a neighbor. She saw a tall man slumped against the frame. He wore a dark silk suit that looked like it cost more than her entire building, now soaked through and clinging to a powerful, lean frame. His face was a mask of sharp angles and high cheekbones, deathly pale from blood loss. Wet, jet-black strands of hair clung to his forehead. But it was the red that stopped her breath. A deep, blooming crimson staining his white dress shirt, mixing with the rain to create a trail of blood on her doorstep. He looked like a fallen king, dangerous, authoritative, and utterly broken. Every rational cell in Amani's body screamed for her to keep the door locked. This was a man of violence. This was a predator. But as his eyes flickered open, sharp, pained, and desperate, Amani didn't see a monster. She saw a life slipping away. Her hand reached for the deadbolt. One turn would change her world forever. Hello, family. Before we continue, I would like to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel. Now let's go back into the story. The silence that followed the slamming of the door was heavy, broken only by the frantic, wet wheezing of the man on Amani's rug and the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the brick exterior. Amani stood over him, her chest heaving, her hands covered in a warmth that made her stomach churn. The light from the single bulb in her kitchen cast long, distorted shadows, making the blood on his white silk shirt look like a void in the center of his chest. She didn't have time for the luxury of a panic attack. Her younger brother, Malik, was asleep in the other room, and if this man, this wounded predator, stopped breathing on her floor, their lives were over in a way no eviction notice could match. Amani dropped to her knees, the old linoleum cold against her skin. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the buttons of his suit jacket. Up close, the quality of the fabric was staggering. It was a deep charcoal silk that felt like water, now ruined by the jagged tear of a bullet and the copper-scented deluge of his own life force. As she peeled the jacket back, her natural curls fell over her face, frizzy from the humidity, but she didn't brush them away. She saw the wound. It was high on his ribs, a dark, weeping puncture that pulsed with every shallow breath he took. His pale skin looked like carved marble under the warm light, making the deep brown of her own trembling hands stand out in sharp, visceral contrast. He was terrifyingly beautiful, even as he hovered on the edge of death, his jaw clenched so tight the bones seemed ready to snap. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. She scrambled to her feet and rushed to the bathroom, grabbing the small, battered plastic bin she used as a first aid kit. It was a pathetic collection, a bottle of cheap antiseptic, a few rolls of gauze she'd scavenged from her last job, and a sewing kit with a single spool of black thread. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But as she returned to the living room, she remembered her mother's hands, how she had taught Amani to mend things that were broken, whether they were clothes or spirits. Amani knelt back down, her heart hammering. She soaked a clean rag in the antiseptic and pressed it against the wound. The man's body jolted, a guttural groan ripping from his throat that made Amani flinch, but he didn't pull away. His eyes flickered open, the dark irises unfocused but burning with a sudden, sharp intensity. He reached out, his bloody hand catching her wrist in a grip that was surprisingly strong for a man dying on a rug. "Who?" he rasped, the word choked with blood and pain. "Nobody," Amani replied, her voice gaining a sudden, strange steadiness. "I'm nobody, but if you don't let me do this, you're a dead man." For a long second, they stayed like that, the powerful stranger and the girl with nothing, locked in a silent battle of wills. The rain outside seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the tension in his arms snapped, and his hand fell back to the floor, his eyes closing in a forced surrender. Amani worked with a focused, desperate speed. She had no anesthesia, no professional tools, only the steady rhythm of her own resolve. She used the antiseptic to clean the entry point, the smell of chemicals and iron filling the small space. Her hands shook as she threaded the needle, the thin black line looking like a joke against the gravity of the injury. Every time she pierced his skin, she felt the jolt of his muscles, the raw heat of his fever beginning to take hold. She was stitching a man together as if he were a torn shirt, her earth-tone sweater now completely stained with the dark crimson of his debt. As she pulled the final knot tight, her breath hitched. She had stabilized the bleeding. She had performed a miracle on a kitchen floor, using nothing but stupid pride and a sewing needle. She slumped back against her old sofa, her strength suddenly failing her. The stranger's breathing had leveled out into a heavy, rhythmic drone. He looked smaller now, vulnerable in the way only a powerful thing can be when it is broken. Amani looked at her hands, deep brown, stained red, and more powerful than she had ever realized. She had saved him. But as she watched the shadows dance on his sharp, angular face, she realized the storm hadn't ended. It had simply moved inside. The silence inside the apartment was deceptive, heavy with the metallic tang of blood, and the sharp, clinical sting of the cheap antiseptic Amani had grabbed from beneath the sink. She knelt on the cold linoleum, her knees aching, but she barely felt the discomfort. All her focus was narrowed down to the man lying on her floor, a fallen titan in a ruined kingdom of silk and shadows. Her hands, a rich, deep brown against the stark, pale marble of his skin, trembled violently. She had to clench them into fists for a moment just to steady her pulse. This wasn't a minor scrape or a school project Malik had brought home. This was a visceral, life-threatening wound. The bullet had grazed the side of his ribs, leaving a jagged, weeping hole that pulsed with every shallow, ragged breath he took. She reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric of his suit jacket. Even soaked in rain and gore, the charcoal silk felt impossibly soft, a luxury so far removed from her world of worn sweaters and second-hand cotton that it felt like touching something from another dimension. She peeled the jacket back, the expensive lining making a wet, sucking sound as it separated from his skin. With a pair of dull kitchen shears, she began the grim task of cutting away his white dress shirt. The fabric was heavy with blood, sticking to his torso like a second, grisly layer. As the wound was fully revealed, Amani felt a surge of nausea, but she shoved it down with the same iron she used to survive the city every day. She didn't have the luxury of being sick. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though he was drifting in the gray space between consciousness and the void. "This is going to hurt." She poured the antiseptic directly onto the wound. The man's body arched off the floor, a guttural, choked sound ripping from his throat. His hand shot out, his long, blood-stained fingers seizing Amani's forearm. His grip was like iron, a terrifying reminder of the power he held even as he bled out on a stranger's floor. His eyes snapped open, dark, unfocused, but burning with a primal, predatory intensity. For a heartbeat, they were locked together in the dim light. The girl who had nothing and the man who looked like he owned the world. "Don't," he rasped, his voice a low, jagged vibration that vibrated through her own bones. "If I don't, you die," Amani said, her voice surprisingly firm despite the tears of terror stinging her eyes. "Let go, please." The strength left him as quickly as it had come. His hand fell back to the linoleum with a dull thud, and his eyes clouded over again. Amani didn't wait for his permission a second time. She threaded her largest needle with the black silk thread from her sewing kit. It was a mockery of a surgical tool, a household item intended for mending Malik's school uniforms, but it was the only miracle she had left. She began to sew. Every time the needle pierced his flesh, her own stomach twisted in sympathy. She wasn't a doctor, just a daughter who had watched her mother mend the unmendable for years. She worked with a frantic, desperate precision, pulling the edges of the jagged tear together, her natural curls falling forward to veil her face as she concentrated. The kitchen felt smaller with every stitch, the air thick and hot. Sweat beaded on her forehead, dripping onto the floor beside the expanding pool of red. She lost track of time, lost track of the storm outside, and even lost track of the eviction notice taped to the front door. There was only the needle, the thread, and the steady, terrifying rhythm of his heart beneath her palms. When the last knot was tied and the bleeding finally slowed to a sluggish drip, Amani slumped back against the kitchen cabinets. Her earth-tone sweater was ruined, the wool heavy and dark with his blood. She looked at her hands, stained, shaking, and yet they had held the line. She had performed a miracle with a dollar store sewing kit and a steady hand. But as she watched the steady rise and fall of the stranger's chest, a new fear took root. She had saved the predator, and now she was trapped in the cage with him. The storm had retreated to a distant, low rumble, leaving the apartment in a suffocating, heavy silence. Gray dawn light filtered through the cracked window pane, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Amani hadn't slept. She sat on the edge of the worn sofa, her body stiff and aching, her eyes fixed on the man lying on her floor. She had moved him to a thin mattress she dragged from Malik's room, and now, in the cold light of morning, the scene looked even more surreal. The change in the room didn't happen with a sound. It happened with a shift in the very molecules of the air. One moment, the apartment felt like her sanctuary, however crumbling. The next, it felt like a cage. It started with his breathing. The ragged, wet wheeze was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it was terrifying. Then, his hand moved, just a twitch of long, elegant fingers against the faded fabric of the mattress. Amani held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Han Jae-Min didn't groan. He didn't struggle. He simply opened his eyes. They weren't the unfocused, pained eyes of the man who had collapsed on her doorstep. They were sharp, dark, and terrifyingly lucid. He didn't move his head. He simply scanned the room with a cold, tactical precision. Amani felt a shiver of pure, primal dread crawl up her spine. Even lying flat on his back, stitched together with black sewing thread, he radiated a lethal authority that made the small room feel claustrophobic. His gaze finally landed on her. For a long, agonizing minute, neither of them spoke. Jae-Min's expression was a mask of unreadable stone, but his eyes were like knives, dissecting her. He looked at her natural curls, frizzy and unstyled. He looked at her deep brown skin, still smudged with his dried blood, and he looked at the worn, earth-tone sweater that was now a ruin of stains. He slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows. Amani moved to help him, but the sudden, sharp flash of warning in his eyes froze her in place. Despite the agony that must have been tearing at his ribs, his movements were controlled, almost graceful. He looked down at the crude, black stitches holding his side together, then back at her. "You," he said. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. I closed the wound," Amani managed to say, her voice sounding thin and small in the face of his presence. "You were dying." Jae-Min didn't thank her. Instead, his gaze drifted past her, taking in the rest of her life. He saw the final notice utility bills sitting on the table. He saw the empty pantry doors hanging slightly ajar. He saw the flickering, dim bulb and the peeling wallpaper. A slow, cold realization seemed to settle over him. He wasn't in a hospital. He wasn't in a safe house. He was in the home of a nobody. A girl who clearly couldn't afford her own life, yet had somehow found the audacity to save his. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "No," Amani lied, though her soul knew the truth. "I just knew you wouldn't make it to the end of the street." A ghost of a smile, cold and devoid of humor, flickered across his pale lips. He looked at her hands, the hands that had sewn his flesh back together, and then back at the squalor of the apartment. The contrast was a physical ache. He was a man who moved mountains and broke empires, and he had been saved by a girl who was 1 week away from the sidewalk. The dangerous aura she had sensed earlier grew until it felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. He wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature that had accidentally crashed into her fragile world. "You saved a debt you cannot collect, Amani Rivers," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. He hadn't asked her name, yet he spoke it as if he had already memorized her entire history. The air in the living room felt electric, charged with the sudden, violent intersection of two worlds that were never meant to touch. Amani realized then that she hadn't just saved a stranger. She had invited the darkness into her home, and now that it was awake, it had no intention of leaving quietly. The gray, unforgiving light of morning crawled across the floorboards, exposing the scars of the night before with a brutal clarity. Amani jolted awake, her neck stiff from leaning against the sofa, her heart immediately leaping into a frantic gallop. The apartment was silent, too silent. The rhythmic, heavy drone of the stranger's breathing had vanished, replaced by the hollow whistle of the wind through the cracked window pane. She scrambled to her feet, her gaze darting to the thin mattress on the floor. It was empty. The rumpled sheets were still stained with the dark, copper shadows of his blood, and the air still held the faint, lingering scent of expensive cologne and antiseptic, but the man was gone. He had vanished like a ghost in the dawn, leaving no trace of how a man with a stitched-up side and a fever had managed to navigate the 3 flights of stairs in total silence. Amani stood in the center of her small living room, her hands trembling as she clutched the elbows of her ruined sweater. The dangerous aura that had filled the space just hours ago had evaporated, leaving the room feeling colder and smaller than it ever had before. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had hallucinated the whole thing. The blood, the silk suit, the predatory eyes that seemed to see right through her soul. Then her eyes fell on the small, scarred wooden table where her final notice, utility bills, still sat, a grim reminder of her reality. Sitting directly on top of the red-inked warning was an object that didn't belong in her world. It was a heavy, solid gold signet ring. Amani approached the table slowly, as if the ring might bite. Under the dim morning light, the gold seemed to glow with an inner fire. She picked it up, and the weight of it nearly made her drop it. It was dense, pure, and chillingly cold. On its face was an intricate crest, a snarling tiger entwined with a lotus, carved with a precision that spoke of ancient power and modern wealth. It was a mark of status, a seal of a kingdom she wasn't supposed to know existed. As she held it, she realized there was no money left behind. No stack of bills to pay the $900 rent or the $250 in late fees, just this piece of him. It wasn't a gift, it was a promise. A blood debt, forged on a kitchen floor with a sewing needle and a girl's stupid pride. She looked at her bank app on her phone, $14.12. Then she looked at the ring in her palm, which likely cost more than the entire building she was about to be kicked out of. The contrast was a physical ache in her chest. She could sell it, she realized. She could take it to a pawn shop, pay her bills, and buy the shoes he needed. But the memory of Jae-Min's eyes, dark, sharp, and all-knowing, stopped her. He hadn't left her a way out, he had left her a way in. By leaving the ring, he hadn't just acknowledged her mercy, he had claimed her as a part of his world. Amani walked to the door and looked at the eviction notice. 5 days. The clock was still ticking, and the city was still waiting to swallow her whole. She tucked the gold ring into the secret pocket of her jeans, the weight of it pressing against her hip like a weapon. The stranger in the rain was gone, but the silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was waiting. Amani Rivers was still a girl with nothing, But as she stared out at the gray Brooklyn skyline, she knew the nobody who had saved a mafia boss was gone too. Something else was beginning to take her place. The 5 days evaporated with the cruelty of a summer rain on hot pavement. By the morning of the 5th day, Amani's apartment felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for the end of her life. She had spent the last 96 hours staring at the gold signet ring on her table, its snarling tiger mocking her silence. She hadn't sold it. Every time she reached for it, the memory of Jae-Min's dark, dissecting eyes stopped her heart. It was a debt, and in her neighborhood, you didn't sell a debt to a man like that unless you wanted to pay with your life. The pounding at the door came at precisely 10 in the morning. It wasn't the ragged thud of a dying man. It was the sharp, impatient rap of someone who held the deed to her misery. Amani stood in the center of the room, her slim frame looking even more delicate in her worn sweater. She didn't look through the peephole. She knew it was Mr. Henderson, a man whose soul was as gray and peeling as the wallpaper in the hall. "Rivers, I know you're in there," Henderson's voice grated through the wood. "The 5 days are up. I've got the locks and I've got the sheriff down the block. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Amani reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the heavy, cold gold of the ring. She opened the door. Henderson stood there, a ring of keys jangling at his hip and a sneer fixed on his face. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her like a stain that needed to be scrubbed away so he could hike the rent for the next desperate soul. "I don't have it, Mr. Henderson," Amani said, her voice small but steady. "I just need another." "No more time. Out, now." He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the doorframe to force his way in. But he stopped. His head tilted, a look of confusion crossing his features. Then, a low, tectonic rumble began to shake the floorboards. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't the subway. It was the synchronized growl of high-performance engines, dozens of them, vibrating through the brick and mortar of the building. Henderson turned toward the window at the end of the hall, and Amani followed him, her heart leaping into her throat. Below them, on the narrow, trash-strewn street of their Brooklyn block, the world was being rewritten. A line of jet-black SUVs, 12 in total, rounded the corner in perfect, terrifying formation. They were sleek, armored, and tinted so deeply they looked like holes cut into the morning light. The convoy didn't just arrive, it occupied. They pulled onto the sidewalks, blocking the fire hydrants and pinning Henderson's rusted sedan against the curb. The neighborhood, usually loud with the sounds of sirens and shouting, fell into a deathly, expectant silence. Doors opened in unison. Men stepped out, men who looked like they were carved from the same cold stone as Jae-Min. They wore sharp black suits that glinted in the sun, their earpieces catching the light as they surveyed the rooftops with predatory efficiency. "What the hell is this?" Henderson whispered, his face draining of color. "A federal raid, is this for you?" Amani couldn't answer. She watched as the middle SUV, the largest of the fleet, remained closed for a heartbeat longer than the others. The back door opened, and a man stepped out. He wasn't the bloodied, pale ghost she had sewn together on her kitchen floor. He was a titan. Han Jae-Min stood in the center of the street, his powerful build draped in a charcoal suit that looked like liquid smoke. He looked upward, his sharp, angular face catching the light, his eyes finding Amani's window with the accuracy of a heat-seeking missile. He didn't look like a man who owed a debt. He looked like a man who had come to collect a soul. The men in suits formed a corridor, their presence turning the dilapidated street into a fortress. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his brow, looked up at the window and spoke into his wrist. Amani felt the gold ring in her pocket grow warm, as if it were pulsing in time with the engines below. She looked at Henderson, who was now trembling so hard his keys were rattling like wind chimes. "I think," Amani whispered, her voice finally finding its strength, "that my miracle just arrived." Downstairs, Jae-Min began to walk toward the entrance of the building, the sea of black suits parting for him. He moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, a reminder that the predator Amani had saved was no longer trapped, and he was coming for her. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots on the tenement stairs sounded like a drum roll for the inevitable. Mr. Henderson had retreated against the peeling wallpaper, his chest heaving as he stared at the door. When it finally swung open, it didn't creak. It moved with a silent, heavy authority that made the air in the narrow hallway turn to ice. Han Jae-Min stepped into the frame, and the small, cramped apartment seemed to shrink around him. The man who had bled out on Amani's kitchen floor was gone. In his place stood a figure of terrifying, absolute polish. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that moved like liquid over his powerful frame, a white dress shirt buttoned to the throat, and a silk tie as dark as a moonless night. His face, once ghostly and strained with the shadow of death, was now a masterpiece of sharp, cold lines. His skin was no longer pale but glowing with a lethal vitality, and his eyes, those dark, obsidian depths, were as sharp as the blades he likely commanded. He looked at Amani, ignoring the cowering landlord as if he were nothing more than a stray shadow. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her natural curls, her wide, expressive eyes, and the simple, earth-tone sweater she had never managed to get the blood out of. "You," he said, his voice a rich, low velvet that made the floorboards vibrate. Amani felt the gold signet ring in her pocket pulse against her hip. She stood her ground, her slim frame trembling but her chin lifted. "You're alive." "Because of you," Jae-Min replied. He took a single step into the room, and the dangerous aura she remembered from the storm returned tenfold. It was the smell of expensive tobacco, rain, and a power so vast it felt like a physical weight. Behind him, the man with the jagged scar across his brow, the one Amani had seen from the window, stepped forward and handed a thick, cream-colored envelope to Jae-Min. Jae-Min didn't look at it. He held it out toward Amani. "This building is no longer your concern," he said. He glanced at Mr. Henderson, who let out a small, pathetic whimper. "In fact, your landlord is currently debating whether he should retire or face a thorough audit of his business practices. He decided on retirement 5 minutes ago." Henderson didn't wait to hear more. He turned and fled down the stairs, his jangling keys fading into the distance. Amani looked at the envelope, then back at Jae-Min. "I didn't save you for money." "I know why you saved me, Amani Rivers," Jae-Min said, and for the first time, a flicker of something human, something almost like respect, softened the hard edges of his expression. "You saved me because your heart is too large for this small, broken world. You gave a miracle to a man who had forgotten they existed." He stepped closer, reaching out to brush a stray curl from her forehead. His touch was cool, his fingers steady. "A signet ring for a life, that was the debt, but a man like me does not settle for mere repayment." "What do you want?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I want to take you out of the shadows," Jae-Min said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "You saved my life. Now I will build you a new one where you never have to count the cents in your hand or fear the knock at the door, one where the world finally sees the woman I saw through the rain." He gestured toward the open door, where the corridor of black suits waited in the hall. "The cars are waiting. Your brother is already being picked up from school by my most trusted men. He is safe. You are safe. But the girl in the worn sweater dies today." Amani looked back at her small, empty kitchen, at the spot on the floor where she had stitched him together with a sewing needle. She realized then that the nobody she had been was already gone. She looked at Jae-Min, a man of silk and blood, and saw the door to a kingdom she never dreamed of. "Are you asking me," she asked, her voice gaining a sudden crystalline strength, "or telling me?" A slow, predatory smile touched Jae-Min's lips. "I am inviting you to rule, Amani. The choice, as always, is yours." Amani reached into her pocket, pulled out the gold signet ring, and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Without a word, she stepped past him and into the hall, the sea of black suits bowing as she passed. Behind her, Jae-Min followed, his shadow long and dark, finally claiming the light she had given him. The transition from the decaying halls of Brooklyn to the glass and steel heights of Manhattan happened in a blur of motion and engine hum. The armored SUV glided through the city like a predatory shark, eventually pulling into a private underground garage that felt more like a bunker than a parking structure. Before Amani could even process the departure from her old life, she was whisked upward in a high-speed elevator, the pressure in her ears changing as the world she knew sank far below. The elevator doors opened directly into a penthouse that redefined the word sanctuary. It was a cathedral of marble, silk, and silence. Floor to ceiling, windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline, but the glass was reinforced, thick enough to stop a high-caliber round. The air was climate-controlled and smelled of sandalwood and expensive clean linen, a far cry from the damp rot of her apartment. "This is your home now," Jae-Min said, his voice echoing softly against the polished stone. He gestured toward a woman standing near the hallway, dressed in a sharp, professional suit. "This is Alina. She has prepared everything you require. I have matters to attend to, but I will see you for dinner." Amani felt like a ghost haunting a palace. She was led to a bedroom larger than her entire former apartment. On the expansive bed lay a selection of garments that seemed to glow with their own light. There were silks that felt like liquid, tailored wools, and shoes crafted from leather, so soft it felt like skin. With a trembling hand, Amani reached out and touched a deep emerald gown. It was a far cry from the worn, earth-tone sweater she currently wore, the sweater that still bore the faint, stubborn iron scent of Jae-Min's blood. She moved to the mirror, catching sight of herself. She looked small, a delicate figure of deep brown skin and natural curls surrounded by a fortress of luxury. She stripped away the old wool, feeling a strange pang of grief as she discarded the last piece of the nobody she used to be. She showered in a stall of heated stone, washing away the grime of the Brooklyn streets, and stepped into a suit of charcoal-colored silk. As she fastened the buttons, she felt the gold signet ring on her finger. It felt heavier now, no longer a promise but a weight. But as she walked back into the main living area, the luxury began to reveal its jagged edges. She noticed the men standing on the balcony, not just servants, but sentries with submachine guns tucked discreetly beneath their jackets. She saw the way Jae-Min's shadow, the man with the jagged scar, hovered near every entrance, his eyes never resting. She stepped toward the window, looking down at the flickering lights of the city. A faint reflection in the glass caught her eye. Beyond the primary security detail, a black car sat idling at the corner of the street below, its lights off. It had been there since they arrived. "The view is beautiful, isn't it?" Amani jumped. Jae-Min had returned, his jacket removed, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos on his forearms, marks of a history written in violence. He stood beside her, but he wasn't looking at the skyline. He was looking at the street below. "Who are they?" Amani asked, her voice a soft tremor. Jae-Min's jaw tightened, the sharp lines of his face catching the moonlight. "Those who believe that by saving me, you made yourself a target. In my world, Amani, mercy is often mistaken for a vulnerability. They think you are the chink in my armor." Amani looked at her reflection, the high-fashion silk, the gold ring, the polished hair. She realized then that the penthouse wasn't just a reward. It was a cage designed to keep the world out and her in. She had traded the threat of a landlord for the threat of an assassin. The nobody from Brooklyn was safe from the cold and the hunger, but she was now a piece on a chessboard she didn't know how to play. "Are they coming for me?" she asked. Jae-Min turned to her, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying, protective fire. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "They may try, but they forget one thing. You didn't just save a man that night. You saved a monster, and a monster knows exactly how to tear apart anything that threatens his sanctuary." Amani realized then that the silk of her new life was inextricably laced with blood. She wasn't just his guest or his ward. She was the only heart beating in a world of stone, and as the black car below finally began to move, she knew the war for her life had only just begun. The penthouse, for all its marble and glass, felt like a pressure cooker as the week wore on. Amani adjusted to the weight of the silk against her skin, but she could never quite shake the feeling of being watched. Jae-Min remained a shadow in his own home, moving between hushed meetings and late-night phone calls. The air was thick with a tension she recognized from the Brooklyn streets, the silent, heavy charge that preceded a lightning strike. It happened during a small, private dinner intended to celebrate a new business venture. Jae-Min sat at the head of the long obsidian table, flanked by his two most trusted lieutenants, including the man with the jagged scar, Kale. Amani sat opposite him, her deep brown skin glowing against a cream-colored silk dress, the gold signet ring catching the light every time she reached for her glass. The atmosphere was cordial, but Amani's gaze kept drifting to the server, a young man with trembling fingers who was pouring wine. She saw the way his eyes darted toward Kale, and the way Kale's hand hovered just a half-inch too close to his inner jacket pocket. In the slums, you learned to read the rhythm of a person's breath before you heard their words. Amani noticed Kale wasn't eating. He wasn't drinking. He was waiting. When Kale stood up, ostensibly to offer a toast, Amani saw the slight, almost imperceptible nod he gave the server. Her heart didn't just beat, it exploded. "Jae-Min, wait!" she cried out, her voice cutting through the elegant silence like a blade. In the same heartbeat, the server reached for a tray where a suppressed pistol lay hidden beneath a linen napkin. But Amani was faster. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the instinct of someone who had spent a lifetime dodging the unexpected. She grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from the center of the table and hurled it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The glass shattered against the server's temple just as he squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, shattering a floor-to-ceiling window behind Jae-Min. Kale lunged, his own weapon clearing his holster, but the split-second distraction Amani had created was all Jae-Min needed. With a roar of predatory fury, Jae-Min kicked the table upward, sent the heavy obsidian crashing into Kale, and drew his own firearm in a blur of motion. The room erupted into a symphony of violence. Shouts echoed through the penthouse as Jae-Min's loyal guards flooded the room. Within seconds, the traitors were pinned to the marble floor, the elegant dinner party reduced to a battlefield of broken glass and spilled wine. Jae-Min stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying fire. He didn't look at the traitors. He looked at Amani. She was standing by the window, her hands shaking, her silk dress splattered with the red wine that looked hauntingly like the blood she had cleaned off her kitchen floor. He walked toward her, his footsteps crunching on the broken crystal. The guard stepped back, sensing the raw intensity radiating from him. When he reached her, he didn't pull away. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "You saw it," he whispered, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "Before my own security, before my own instincts, you saw the shadow." "I grew up in the dark, Jae-Min," Amani said, her voice trembling but her gaze unwavering. "You learn to see what's moving in it." Jae-Min leaned his forehead against hers, a rare, vulnerable gesture that stunned the men in the room. "They thought you were my weakness," he murmured, his grip on her face tightening with a fierce, protective pride. "They didn't realize you are the only reason I am still standing. Twice now, Amani Rivers, twice you have snatched my soul back from the grave." He turned toward his men, his voice turning to ice. "Clear this out, and find everyone Kale spoke to in the last 48 hours. No mercy." As they were led away, Amani looked down at her hands. The gold ring was still there. She realized then that she wasn't just a girl he was protecting anymore. She had become his eyes in the dark, the calm mind in his chaos. She had passed the test of loyalty not because she feared him, but because she understood him. The worn sweater was gone, but the girl who knew how to survive was very much alive, and she was starting to realize that in this world of silk and blood, she was the most dangerous player of all. The transition from the world of shadows to the light of the public eye didn't happen with a roar, but with a series of quiet, late-night conversations in the fortified penthouse. Amani had spent weeks poring over the ledgers of Jae-Min's empire, her sharp mind, the one that had once survived on $14, seeing the structural decay that violence always left behind. She realized that while fear could build a kingdom, only purpose could sustain one. "You have the resources to move mountains," she had told him one evening, her hand resting on his as he sat at his obsidian desk. "But you're currently using them to dig graves. Let me show you a different way to be untouchable." Jae-Min, a man who had lived his entire life by the blade, had listened. He listened because Amani was the only person in his world who wanted nothing from him but his survival. Under her guidance, the syndicate began to shed its jagged skin. Shell companies once used for laundering were restructured into investment firms for urban renewal. Smuggling routes were converted into logistics chains for underserved communities. It was a slow, dangerous alchemy, turning blood into gold and gold into hope. A year later, the city's skyline looked the same, but the power dynamic had shifted forever. Amani stood in the wings of a grand ballroom at the St. Regis, the air shimmering with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. Gone was the girl in the worn sweater who counted pennies by candlelight. In her place was a woman of breathtaking presence, draped in a gown of midnight blue velvet that complemented the deep, radiant glow of her skin. The gold signet ring still sat on her finger, but it was no longer a symbol of a hidden debt. It was the seal of the Rivers Hand Foundation. "Are you ready?" Jae-Min's voice was low, standing just inches behind her. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like armor, his posture relaxed, but his eyes still carrying that sharp, predatory edge. He was no longer the man the city feared as a ghost. He was the man the city respected as a titan of industry. "I've been ready since the night I opened that door," Amani replied, her voice steady and resonant. As they stepped out into the blinding flash of cameras and the applause of the city's elite, Amani didn't see the glitter of the diamonds or the fawning smiles of politicians. She saw the faces of people like her grandmother, like Malik, and like the neighbors she had left behind in Brooklyn. As the CEO of the most well-funded humanitarian foundation in the country, she was no longer a victim of the system. She was the architect of a new one. She took her place at the podium, Jae-Min standing a half-step behind her, a silent shadow of support. She looked out at the crowd, her hand instinctively touching the spot on the podium where her brother sat in the front row, his future secured. "Kindness is often mistaken for a weakness," Amani began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I was told for a long time that because I had very little, I was nothing. But I learned that the greatest power isn't found in what you take, but in what you are willing to protect." Beside her, Jae-Min watched her with a pride that bordered on reverence. He had built her a new life, but in doing so, she had built him a soul. The steel and silk arc was complete. They were no longer a predator and a victim caught in a storm. They were the masters of their own empire. As the gala ended and they returned to the quiet of their car, Amani looked out at the rain-streaked window. The city was still harsh, and the darkness still lingered at the edges, but she wasn't afraid. She had moved from the shadows of poverty into the light of high-stakes power, proving that a single act of mercy could indeed move the world. She was Amani Rivers, the woman who had everything, because she was the woman who had been brave enough to give everything when she had nothing at all.